one of the fundamental questions we have to ask ourselves before we look at how do we leverage our seasonal abundance is what's actually present in my food shed? What's in my food shed now that I can leverage the use of, whether I'm actively growing at this period of time or not? Because when it comes to food security, not everybody's got a yard to grow in, and not everyone has, if they do have a yard, not everyone has access to a ton of space, or some folks are growing in containers. Some people don't have any space at all. So the way that they would leverage the seasonal currency in their situation would be to optimize the use of some of the local resources that are available to them. So what are the local farmers bringing to the mix? So we want to focus on this regional aspect, right? Obviously, we're going to get a lot more anti-fragility in our food supply system, in our food security, greatest levels of food security if we really focus on obtaining our food source regionally. But also this seasonal piece is really, really key. We don't really, need to be accessing avocados from Mexico in January. They're not a local produce, but they're also certainly not seasonal for us. And the key to leveraging our own seasonal abundance is really knowing what's available locally and seasonally. That's really key. Knowing what we can grow ourselves and or what we have access to from other sources. That's really important. And then another key piece is really being ready and able to act when the time is right. So whether that's when's the right time to harvest your produce, or when's the right time to capture it at its peak nutritional capacity, and then have the ability to capture that in a way that allows you to use that for the winter, for the long term. Because one of our big issues here where we live is our very short growing season and our very long basically dearth period, where we're not able to actually actively grow outside. So we're not producing food during that time period. So if we're not willing to not only grow in that period of time or access that produce when it's available seasonally, and then do something with it that allows it to give us its life energy and its nutritional components throughout those long winter months, then we just don't eat during those winter months. So we need to be ready and able to act when the time is right. So we can grow our own, keeping it really simple. We don't have to get too complicated if we're starting out. We can start our own growing club. This is something that I think would be just a really great idea. And there's some communities that are doing this in a small way, where you do a produce exchange. So basically one person says, this year I'm going to grow potatoes and beets. And someone else might say, well, I'm going to grow kale and kohlrabi this year. And you arrange with a number of people who get to learn how to grow one crop really well, one or two crops really well, get really good at storage options for those crops or processing options, and then they exchange. And in so doing, they learn along the way. You can purchase directly from a local producer, purchase at a local farmer's market, right? Was it just another step away from that, or purchase locally through a grocery store. And we're very lucky where I live. We've got a particular grocery store chain that is really key on bringing in primarily local produce. So I really love that. So this is a slide that sort of, looks at, those concentric circles away from anti-fragility, where you've got a little less resilience the further out you go from that center of having your home and community garden. But those direct relationships with local producers or cooperative food buying clubs are also an option, or food growing clubs, as I just mentioned. A farmer's market, it's still typically local producers, but you're, again, one step removed from having that personal direct relationship with the producer. So if you're not growing your own, and even if you are, there's some things you may not be growing, creating a direct and personal relationship with those local producers is always going to give you, a lot more food security. And then, of course, the last option is purchasing through a supermarket. So I put together this chart of what's Carmen's seasonal fresh food shed. So this is fresh food that we can grow or store so that we've got food throughout the year. So of course, there's some things that we're not going to be eating in February and March because we've eaten it already. It just won't store that long. So we have to be willing, in our case, to eat seasonally, to eat the things that we can grow seasonally, not expect to eat them, in the early winter to late spring, unless we have stored them or preserved them in some way that has captured that essence of that food and that nutritional density. So this was a fun exercise. I really encourage folks to try something like this and see what kind of abundance they actually have that they're able to produce on their own property, or what's available to them. It doesn't have to be something that you're growing yourself. So this is also, I did a little exercise about this for some students for a food security workshop that I did recently. And I just looked at all the kind of different systems that we have in place where we can access the food that we like to regularly eat. Now, there's nothing here that is tropical, or like there's no avocados from Mexico or mangoes or anything like that. Everything is hyper local. And I really, when I put this slide together, I was like gobsmacked at how much food is and other products are actually available to me right in my region. And so again, this is a wonderful exercise to do. It's basically very similar to the last slide, but in a different kind of way. And then of course, our wild foraging options are just unlimited. There was never going to be enough room on this slide for all of those. So, but just to show you what kind of abundance is available if we're willing to eat locally and seasonally. So there's a real wisdom, I think, around eating seasonally that I really, really love. And there's a lot of evidence that shows that eating food that is available seasonally, is grown locally, actually helps contribute to a healthier, more diverse gut microbiome. And that's largely due to the fact that food is at its nutritional and energetic peak when it's grown locally and it's available and it's grown seasonally and consumed seasonally. So of course, the longer you store produce for, or even processing it, it does decrease, obviously, the biological diversity. In fact, if you're processing something, whether that's in a hot water bath canner or a pressure canner, you're pretty well destroying your soil microbes or any microbes that are in your food. But any storage system, the point is that it's going to nutritional density is going to decrease over time. So eating food at its nutritional energetic peak allows us to optimize the use of those microbes that are present in the soil, and thus really keep our own gut microbiome at its optimal level as well. And I love the idea of eating seasonally as a way for helping us to grab onto that opportunity to harmonize with natural seasonal cycles, to really appreciate the gifts of each season, right? That's really something that we've fallen away from. And I think in order for our long-term health and happiness, I think this is a really, really great strategy to bring us back into balance. And not to mention the fact that out-of-season produce requires all these artificially created growing environments or this long-distance transportation. And for sure that the nutritional density and certainly any microbial positives in that food are pretty well, eliminated. And year-round demand for certain produce results obviously in crops that are modified to grow in bulk or harvest, when they're unripe, resist disease and pests and so on. So obviously that food is most often nutritionally inferior. So, I was kind of digging back into my own past with this slide because many, many, many years ago, I was in my early 20s. I had the privilege of studying with this wonderful Japanese woman. And she taught me so much about the balancing effects of different kinds of foods when we eat them in different seasons. So I kind of wanted to introduce you to this idea and show you some examples of how some cultures adapt their culinary expressions to seasonality. So in spring and summer, we eat what mostly grows above the ground, right? This is obviously what grows really well. In the autumn, we mostly eat what grows below the ground. Now there's this concept, I'm not going to get into this too much, of yin and yang, and that spring is a yin season spring is moving from a yin season to a yang season. So summer's a yang season, winter's a yin season. And so we often choose opposite foods in order to balance ourselves out. So in the yang season, in summer, there's a lot of strong fire energy, right? So we get a lot of stuff growing above ground with a lot of vigor. Those long days and short nights, it's an active time where we're restless, we want to be moving, very external and outgoing. Whereas winter is strong, more water energy, short days and long nights. So it's a more passive, restful, internal and introspective time. And the diets shift in these cultures to accommodate that. So in the summer, even pickles would be made with more vinegar and sweet. There'd be lighter sweet misos and tamares, long grains, short and long beans, light colored beans, sweet, juicy, fresh fruit, less meat or lighter meat, simpler carbs, less salty food, less fat. And it's quite the opposite in winter. And so, in the wintertime, we're going to be eating more pickles that would be probably made either through a fermentation process, right? So greens that could be fermented, which makes them much more yang because there's a lot of salt involved. So it balances us out, but also fermented root vegetables like daikon, radish, and so on, pickles in that kind of vein. But she also taught me this wonderful thing, and this is a whole different thing, but I wanted to show you this, was she even taught me how you could cut a vegetable like carrots into different shapes according to the season that would balance out that energy. So I just wanted to show you that there's all these different interesting ways that different cultures have used their local seasonal produce in a way that nurtures them physically in so much more than just the nutritional density of the food. So that's kind of fun. So obviously we need to understand our seasonal cycles wherever we are, what our growing season is, how many frost-free days we have. This slide is true for where we live, but we've got this funky growing season. We've got times when we can be, really focusing on really cold season greenhouse crops if we have the right situation, early cool season crops. We've got warm season crops, which are the ones that are basically frost intolerant. And then later in the season, we can transition again to cool season crops. And the reason I wanted to show this slide is that when it comes to leveraging our seasonal abundance, we certainly do not want to just focus on, this idea of don't plant your garden until the May long weekend where we live, which is roughly when we get our last spring frost. Because if we do, we can only really grow those warm season crops. And there's this massive amount of cool season crops that do extremely well in our northern climate, in our cold seasons. And if we miss out on those, we can't really build that food security that we want, and we're certainly not leveraging seasonal abundance. So if we're only eating what we can grow, if we're only eating fresh what we can grow, these are the time periods roughly for these various crops, and these are just a few crops, of when those might be fresh, that we can eat fresh in these periods of time. So what about all the rest of this? Like what do we eat? We have to be growing crops with this in mind to build our food security. So this is a really a good eye-opening slide when it comes to thinking about, where's my food coming from and how dependent am I? How fragile is my food supply chain? And how can I, improve that and make it a little less fragile in even just small increments? You can make a big shift. No.